Hello again. Over the next couple days, we're going to take a look at one of my favorite writers from the Civil War period. Again, he's somebody who really did much of his writing after the Civil War was over and long after the Civil War was over. But at least in this case, Ambrose Bierce was somebody who saw the Civil War firsthand. He was a soldier. He saw horrors. They affected him deeply. And they show up in his stories that he's going to write for the last half of the 19th century. Our essential question today is going to be, how does this psychological story reflect naturalism and American realism? And we're going to talk about psychological a little bit later in this short presentation, but I want to talk about naturalism and American realism. First of all, they're easy to get confused, and they're related, so it's perfectly, I should say natural, that people will confuse the two of them. As we've been going through this American Lit course, we've talked about different philosophies that affect styles of writing during different time periods. So you might remember back when we got started, we talked about the Enlightenment, which was a European movement, and within 100 years, that had spurred the American Revolution by spreading ideas. The American Revolution comes along, Enlightenment gains hold, people believed that the world is a formula that can be figured out, that you can apply science, and anybody can become anything if you educate yourself properly. But then we moved into the New England Renaissance, and we talked about this idea of transcendentalism, which was an American kind of philosophy that came out of a European movement, European philosophy movement called Romanticism. And Romanticism and transcendentalism, to an extent, both kind of took the approach that there's more to the world than we will ever understand. And that if you want to understand the world, you've got to connect with it, and the best way to do that is through nature. Now we're looking at something called naturalism, which sounds like it would have to do with going out and watching birds in the trees, and to some extent it does, but naturalism looks at the world from the perspective that the world exists, and we're just something in that world. We don't always have control over everything that happens to us. Sometimes we can do all the right things, make all the right choices, and bad things still happen to us. Naturalism is a writing style of this time period, and it's going to continue for the next probably 70, 80 years in American literature. And naturalism, just like transcendentalism kind of came out of Romanticism, naturalism comes out of a philosophical movement which was called determinism. Now, as far as I understand, determinism and naturalism have the same viewpoint of life. We're not in control, things happen, and that's just the way life is. But we're going to be talking mostly about naturalism because we're talking about literature. American realism seems to go very well with the idea of naturalism. American realism is a new style of writing at this time, in which writers portray life the way it really is. They don't take life and give it these magical kind of outlooks. I've heard people say that good writers find the magic in the ordinary. But American realists will find that the ordinary really is the ordinary. And bad things are bad. And good things can be good. But they don't try to put a spin on things. It's an attempt to present American life as it really is. Now, Ambrose Bierce, like I said, is an interesting character. His nickname, once he became well known, was Bitter Bierce, because he has such a dark, sarcastic view of the world. He was born in Ohio. He grew up poor, and when the Civil War came along, he became an officer in the Civil War. He saw ridiculous things. He saw the incredible carnage of the Civil War. He saw people die unnecessarily because commanding officers were sometimes promoted to that position because of the political connections they had rather than their military capability. He saw people die of disease. And this put the dark spin on everything that was going to, show up in his writing for the rest of his life. So that's his pessimism. After the war was over, he went out west. 1849, gold rush comes along. People are going out to California and the San Francisco area, and he becomes a journalist. He's not the only writer who did that. We're going to meet two of his associates. I don't know if they were really friends. They used to hang out together. They criticized one another, but I wasn't there, so I don't know what kind of relationship they had. But when he's in California, he's going to be hanging out with Mark Twain, who did exactly the same kind of thing, except that Mark Twain didn't volunteer in the Civil War. In fact, he kind of took off when the Civil War came so he could avoid it. And also Bret Hart. We're going to take a look at some Bret Hart stuff in the next unit. Bret Hart is actually the creator of the modern Western, the modern cowboy story. Ambrose Bierce, if you look at his dates, you see he was born in 1842, and then you see that little C in front of 1914. That C stands for circa, and it means around 1914. We don't actually know when Ambrose Bierce died, or even how he died. We don't even know if he has a grave. What we do know is this. He went to Mexico. That's it. That's all we know. He went to Mexico, disappeared. There are all kinds of rumors. You can search the internet for all kinds of stories. Some people believe, he was like Elvis. He faked his death and he came back and he just hung out in society, but everybody didn't know he was doing that. Another version of his story has him being killed when Pancho Villa and his gangs who were raiding Mexico at that time killed him. Some people have him just dying down there. We don't know. And so I won't even try to say anything other than he died around 1914. And he is definitely acclaimed for his psychological realism. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later in this presentation as well. Now, we're not going to read the Devil's Dictionary. It's still in print. It's an amazing work, but it's his most famous contribution to literature. Not actually the story that we're going to read today. The Devil's Dictionary is his definition for words, but he gives every definition a really dark, sarcastic twist. And he worked on this book his entire life. He published it in several different forms. I say his entire life, his entire writing career. He didn't start it, obviously, when he was a child, but he kept working on this. And if you look at the slide here, Ambrose Bierce has got some newfound respect. A lot of people in this country study the Civil War. There are you probably know somebody who is a Civil War reenactor, a living historian. And there's a magazine called Civil War Times, which presents new research on the Civil War. And a few years ago, Ambrose Bierce made the cover of a new magazine. Now, the Devil's Dictionary, let's get back to that. I just want to show you what a couple of these definitions are like because they're really dark. So let's take admiration. You know what the word admiration means. It's a good thing. But Ambrose Bierce saw the word admiration as our polite recognition of another's resemblance to ourselves. The idea that we only really like people when they meet our expectations and remind us of us. What about a bride? Brides, yeah, they're happy, right? They marry, they move on, new part of their life. His definition, in a time period when many women didn't have rights, his definition was a woman with a fine prospect of happiness behind her. I don't want to knock anybody here, but we probably all know people who use religion to their own advantage. He defined a Christian as one who believes that the New Testament is a divinely inspired book, admirably suited to the spiritual needs of his neighbor. In other words, the Bible says you should do this, or the Bible says you should do that, instead of being a guide for oneself. Friendship. Sorry, dentist. Got dentist first here. A dentist is a prestidigitator who, putting metal in your mouth, pulls coins out of your pocket. A prestidigitator is a magician who uses sleight of hand, that kind of guy who can take an empty hand and make it look like he just pulled a quarter from your ear. So then there's friendship. We all know what friendship is. Hopefully we all have a friendship with somebody. Have you ever had those times when things aren't so good and your friend isn't there for you like you thought so? Well, Ambrose Bierce's definition of friendship was a ship big enough to carry two people in fair weather, but only one in bad weather. And then there's a hearse. He called it Death's baby carriage. I don't need to even say any more about that one. And one of my favorites, because you see this in society all the time, an idiot. What does he describe an idiot as? He says, an idiot is a member of a large and powerful tribe whose influence in human affairs has always been dominant and controlling. Yeah, Ambrose Bierce is a pretty dark guy. All right, the literary terms we want to pay attention to in this unit. The first one's flashback. We've talked about flashback before. It's whenever you have a story that's in chronological order and all of a sudden you have a piece of that story that goes back to an earlier time. The story that we're going to read today does exactly that. And it's important, so don't skip the flashback when you get to that. And then I said we'd talk about psychological fiction. We know what psychological fiction is because we read Edgar Allan Poe in the last unit. And I know you've read Edgar Allan Poe in probably 10th grade and 9th grade and middle school. Edgar Allan Poe probably, along with Hawthorne, pioneered the idea of psychological fiction. It's the idea that we see stuff happening out in the world all the time, but there's stuff happening in our own heads. In fact, we spend probably more time in our own heads with ourselves than we do with others. And if we look at other people out in that world, we see what's going on outside. But they've got the same stuff going on inside their heads that we do. And these writers pick up on this. You don't have to be a psychologist to understand how people think, and that's what these writers try to get us to do. Now, the piece that you're going to read today is a really famous one. It's called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, and it is American realism. There's some naturalism. That's why we're talking about it here. It's a story about a Southerner by the name of Peyton Farquhar, who's been arrested during the Civil War by the Union Army for attempting to sabotage a Union bridge, and he's going to be executed. And the story is about what happens to him during and after the execution. So pay careful attention to details. This is one of those stories that's going to have a lot of twists and turns, and what's coming next may not be what you expect. So there's a picture for you of what a Civil War bridge looked like. They were mostly built for the railroads. The Union Army went south, destroyed all the Confederate railroads, and then started building new railroads. And what we're going to take a look for as you guys read this story here is I'd like you to look for the irony. It's going to be irony of situation. Remember that terrible definition of irony? Irony is the difference between reality and what you expect kind of thing. But look for that in this story. Look for the psychological characteristics. You're going to be inside Peyton Farquhar's head for much of this story. Look for the suspense. One of the best definitions I ever heard of suspense was it's when we know something's going to happen, but we're not quite sure what it is. Keep your eyes open for that. Flashbacks, like I said, part 2 of the story, and it's not a very long story, but it has parts. Part 2 of the story is a flashback. Keep that in mind as you're reading, that it's not happening now. American realism, look for the descriptions, look for the details. If there's pain, if there's suffering, watch for the idea that the writer, Ambrose Bierce in this case, doesn't make that easy for the reader. Naturalism, again, our main character, Peyton Farquhar, he's not in control of everything that's happening to him here. Look to see how he's sometimes a victim of the natural things in the world that are going on around him. And finally, that satire, that dark, bitter satire. In the next unit, we're going to specialize in satire with Mark Twain, but Mark Twain's satire throughout most of his life was light and humorous. It was only towards his later days when he also turned dark and bitter. But Ambrose Bierce, bitter Bierce, he was always dark. All right, so what you're going to do now is pause the video and go read the story. I've put a couple different versions of the story in the unit folder for you. Depending on the class and the year, you might actually have to do the story by using Actively Learn. Some of you have used Actively Learn in 10th grade, and so you're familiar with it. But Actively Learn will give you the story. There'll be my notes along with the story. You'll be able to get some extra help as you go, and there might be a few questions along the way. Be sure to read those questions and answer them, because that's going to show me that you read this story. Once you're finished with the story, come back here and we'll go over the review questions. The review questions will be on the check for understanding that you're going to take. So if you don't come back here, you're going to miss the answers. All right, I'm going to wait right here while you go read. Oh, you're back already? Are you sure you read it? All right, let's go over the questions. These are some true and false questions about the story. Pretty low-level questions, just checking recall. Number 1, Farquhar was not a Confederate soldier because he was not a Confederate soldier because he sympathized with the Union. True or false? Yeah, that's false. there were reasons that he did not join that the narrator chose not to tell us. Number 2, Farquhar ignored his wife's pleading not to speak with the gray-clad soldier. That's also false. I guess it was maybe Southern hospitality, but Mrs. Farquhar invited the gray-clad soldier in and served him, refreshments at the same time he was speaking with her husband. She was not against this meeting at all. Number 3, the Union soldiers on the bridge treated the hanging with respect and dignity. Absolutely true. This is part of the dark side of Ambrose Bierce. Here they are about to take a man's life, and there's ceremonial niceties that accompany this. It seems very incongruous. Number 4, when Farquhar awakens in the water, he notices that his senses have dulled. That's obviously false. In many cases, we might think that, wow, you were just hanged by the neck. Your senses aren't going to be very sharp at this point. But in his particular case, they become extra sharp. He's aware of everything, including little things like the sounds of insects around him. Number 5, Farquhar's attack on the bridge is described in a flashback. That's true. It's sort of true. There aren't a whole lot of details about what he did to that bridge, but we know that it happened, and we know that it's in a flashback. So that's one of those questions that isn't quite precise enough to get it true or false, but it is true. All right, let's try a couple fill-ins here. We'll use some of the terms and things like that. Number 1, an explanation of why Farquhar is being hanged is given in the story's what? Yeah, even if you haven't read the story, you're going to know from that list of choices that it has to be the story's introduction. It's the only one that makes sense there. 2, Farquhar's musings about the driftwood floating slowly downstream is an example of foreshadowing. And if you're cheating and listening to these answers before you read the story, I'm not going to explain this one to you. You've got to read the story to find out why that's foreshadowing. Number 3, they should have capitalized the sentence. Another typo for our textbook. Number 3, psychological fiction primarily features man versus himself types of conflicts. Another name for man versus himself would be internal conflicts. All right, how about number 4? The sentence, death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect. Boy, you can even see the style of Ambrose Bierce is a little hard to read. The words don't come in the same order. That's called syntax, the same order that we expect. But that would be irony. We talked about that already. And number 5, the increasingly strange images Farquhar encounters as he nears his home blank the story's ending. Now I'm going to give you a hint here. Your textbook made another mistake. There's not one word up there that fits unless you change its form. Yep, you got it right. So it should be foreshadows. I even have it wrong there. I have foreshadow and it should say foreshadows. But foreshadowing would be the wrong form of the word. But that's it. All right, I hope you enjoyed the story. We're going to work again tomorrow with more Ambrose Bierce. But if you have any questions, you know where you can find me on Schoology.